All right, thank you so much for joining us for WIGL Session 3, the trade pathway when good plants go bad. To start us off this afternoon, Dawn Slack will be speaking first. She is from the Nature Conservancy, and she will be speaking on Indiana's plant assessment process and its vital role in development of the terrestrial plant rule. So off to you, Dawn.
All right, well, thank you. I am Dawn, and I'm going to share just a little bit of information about Indiana's assessment process and our pathway to save the biodiversity here in our state. And that is just kind of represented by that photo of the lesser French gentian there on the screen. So when basically is it a time for a rule? When do we need that comprehensive management program? You know, often that process appears to be pretty obvious. When you look at these photos, you're like, oh my gosh, we're past the time. We need to do something now, and let's hurry up and get this going. But you realize if prevention is your first step, you quickly realize how many stakeholders are involved and how many of them must be on board for you to be successful, for that rule to be effective, and for everybody to be on board and not contest that rule. You need to start evaluating those needs and understanding the problem. You need to understand that regulation and education require stakeholder buy-in. You need to understand who your regulator is and that they need science. They need a list, and that list must be backed by science and be objective so that they too also can be on board and help with a rule and regulation. And you need to understand the need for statewide education and outreach, because you want people to take the information that you have and act, not just throw that list on the shelf. So the assessment process in Indiana, we wanted it to be very scientific. We wanted it to be very inclusive. And with that in mind, then a group of experts called the Invasive Plant Species Assessment Working Group, and I'll just call them IPSOG from now on, was created in 2001, and they were created to help the green industry address what species are actually invasive in Indiana. So over a 6-year period from 2001 to 2006, they mapped invasions, they logged impacts, they wrote descriptions and recommendations for terrestrial plant invasions in Indiana. They wanted an assessment process that was objective and that strictly assessed the invasiveness through a point system that could be replicated. They knew they needed 2 forms, one for in-trade species and then one for not in-trade species. Their ultimate result was to determine how invasive is a species and therefore rank them so that ultimately we could have a rule that everyone on board, all of those stakeholders, could buy in and support, and ultimately then not contest once that rule was in place. You can see that long list of partners that are there, and there's kind of that delicate balance and back and forth is how many partners should we get involved? Do we have enough? Do we have too many so that we can make decisions? So there's that delicate balance, but definitely involving those stakeholders right from the beginning is key for success. So let's take a look at this plant and trade form. So this group, IPSOG, was led by Doria Gordon of TNC out of the University of Florida to develop an objective assessment protocol for Indiana. And it was modeled after the Florida assessment process. But the group overall took the information and then altered it after they ran some initial tests with some well-known invasive species. The protocol became a very quantitative approach. Points were given for responses to criterion to create a score within a predetermined range that corresponded then to outcomes. And if you'll look at this table that's here, I've included in parentheses some percentages. And this is just to kind of give you an idea of where they weighted the percentages for each of these sections or these rating sections: ecological, potential for expansion, and difficulty for management. And they really weighted ecological impacts more so than they did the others. This is not all of the sections that are assessed, but those are the 3 that ended up culminating in an actual ranking number. So the protocol that Indiana uses contains two screening questions right from the beginning, and that's the number one there on the bottom left. Those screening questions are imperative because they really produce relevancy and buy-in by our stakeholders. We have to know, where is a species invasive in Indiana? Is it invasive in Indiana? And we use EDMAPs to gather that and glean that information for us. We need to prove a species impacts on the natural ecosystems and native species in Indiana. We must know that. That's the first thing, because if it's not impacting our native ecosystems, then it's not invasive in Indiana per our stakeholders. So once we determine if it's invasive in Indiana, then we assess each species with a series of questions that are based on ecological impacts, potential for expansion, difficulty of management, and commercial value for those plants that are in trade. These series of questions in each of those sections then has a point value assigned to it, again within that predetermined range that corresponds to outcomes. Subranks, as you see in the column there that says score, these subranks are calculated for each section. And then the subranks minus the commercial value, because that doesn't really affect or determine an ecological risk. So minus that commercial value contribute to a total species score. For instance, this one is 86. That translates into high. Some of the data that goes along with each of these sections, ecological, potential for expansion, and so on and so forth, was, where is the species invasive? What's the significance of that impact? Does it only invade highly degraded areas, or does it also impact intact, highly ecological systems and different ecological systems within the state? What is the potential for expansion? How viable is the seed? How long is the seed viable? How does it spread? How difficult is it to control? Can it be eradicated in 1 year? Or does it take many years with many different techniques to control the species? Lastly, what is that commercial value in the state of Indiana? Asking all of these questions and going through a weighted ranking system that produces a numerical score allowed the buy-in of our stakeholders. And again, that was important if we were going to create a rule. So here's an example of one of Burning Bush, which we just actually reassessed as in 2019, just to give you an idea of what the front page and that invasive ranking table and that score looks like. IPSOG completed about 25 plant assessments over a 6-year period. All of those assessments and all of the information for each one of the species they assessed is now housed in a transparent way on the Indiana DNR website, and that link is there on the right. So these assessments laid the foundation for a successful rule, a rule that will be adopted because of the public and stakeholder support during and incorporation during that initial assessment process. So those plant assessments then led next to an official state list. And this is also key. It's important, again, because our regulator has to have a list that's scientifically based that they can use to create a rule. So we had more than 25 species to assess in the state, as you can imagine. So the Invasive Species Council, which was created in 2009, created the Invasive Plant Advisory Committee to continue IPSOG's work. And that group was made up of primarily the same people that made up those initial stakeholders for IPSOG. And that's important because we need that stakeholder buy-in as we move through the process to create a list. Over time, they assessed approximately 95 terrestrial plants, and they presented then this to the council. And the council, because we had the scientific quantitative assessment process that scored each species, that allowed for transparency, duplicity, the council in 2012 agreed to adopt this list as the official state list of invasive plants for Indiana. So here's an example of our official state list. Today we have over 120 plants on this list, and this is the list that then leads us into a rule. Again, 100+ species backed by objective data, supported by stakeholders, adopted by a legislatively created body, and then updated periodically with relevant and new information by a committee of experts that also reaches out beyond just that committee, but to other people within the realm who can help us assess those species. These species are all ranked, as I showed you earlier, high, medium, low, or highly invasive. And from that list, then we can develop a rule. This vetted process with a legislative committee that adopts this rule as a state level, then takes the high-ranked species and creates a rule from that list using only those species that are now ranked high that everyone has agreed upon through the assessment process needs to be pulled out of the in-trade system. So this process ensured the listing decision was based on adequate scientific information with adequate public notice and opportunity for comment throughout both the assessment process per species and during the rulemaking process. It's a long process, but it's difficult to dispute. And we've had our rule in place now for in a year. We had a phase-in period, and we have had contestment to the rule, but because we were able to march through this very objective and quantitative manner and assessment, we were able to challenge that, and the rule held. So with this process, we can compare species assessments, we can update the list, we can then also have a very objective process that's also very transparent. The rule reads, a person must not sell, offer for sale, gift, barter, exchange, or distribute any of those 44 species that are on the rule. If you look at our list, whenever the rule was created, we had 46 species on the rule, 46 species that were ranked high, on the official list. 44 of those were then put on this rule. So here we have this rule. It is activated now, and we have a rule authority that can help us keep our biodiversity and our ecosystems intact, because now we have teeth by this vetted process, and we have a rule authority through the DNR, and they have the ability then to leverage fines as necessary, and they can leverage $500 a day per incident. This rule also allows us then to reach out to the public and say, look, we have this list that goes through a process for every single species. It is duplicative, it is objective, we have science that backs it, it's not subjective, and we can use this as a tool then to educate our public and to garner more support for that rule, which then that rule can now be amended as well as new species come in and we gain new information. We made sure that as we enacted the rule, we also have a guide and a fact sheet for our citizens as well as our industries that can use so that they can learn to identify the species that are on the rule. Lastly, we maintain transparency. That's part of this objective assessment process that every species goes through. And all of those assessments are available to anyone on the Indiana Council's website, and you can access that through the indianainvasivespecies.org. The rule and resources to manage all those species are also available on our Native Plant Society website, as well as one of our larger SISMA's website, and that's sicm.info. So overall, we are making progress. We do have a long ways to go. The rule has been contested once already, and it's only been a year out. But we certainly have laid a very objective and collaborative assessment process, and that has allowed us, I think, to be effective with this rule. It's allowed us to create a state adopted species list that we can update as new information comes in. And absolutely, it's vital for the development of a rule, the maintenance of that rule, and the teeth behind that rule. So with that, I am done.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Really appreciate it. We have a couple of questions that came in. The first one is this IPSOG ranking system similar to the OIPC system in Ohio?
So it is somewhat similar to that system. There are a few differences, but yes, it's primarily the same. They both have not quite the same point system, but it is very similar. In fact, we use data back and forth from both.
Excellent.
New York's is actually almost identical to, and I don't know if they just borrowed what Indiana was doing, but yeah.
They may have been happening close to the same time, but I know we referenced New York's, so
okay.
They were first.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure.
Yep.
Okay, and then the second question that we have is, was there any controversy in the species list between any of the stakeholder groups?
Absolutely, yes. I was not part of that initial assessment process, but I am on the committee, the IPAC, to assess species now. So absolutely, and it's very important to have those people at the table because yes, there is. Always.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dawn. Oh.
We still have about 3 minutes or so for any more questions. Dawn, was the University of Purdue University also involved in that process? I believe they were.
They sure were, yes, and they still are. We do partner with them, and the council is actually housed at the University of Purdue University in their ag department. So absolutely, it's an excellent question.
Excellent. All right. Well, then if we don't have any more questions, then I think we'll move on a little bit early, if that's all right. And the next section that is presenting is Tom Buechel and myself from Buechel Horticultural Solutions and Plant Sentry. We will be presenting on the use of Plant Sentry to educate consumers and provide plants that only benefit the environment. So with that, screen ready. Okay, so Plant Sentry, what are we? We are a systems approach model to eliminate the purchase and shipment of non-compliant plants. What that more specifically means is the shipment and purchase of invasive plant species, pest and disease-laden plants as well. Okay, so how do we work? We locate the source of the regulatory information and interpret it. We then maintain the state and federal regulatory changes year-round for all 50 of the states within the United States. And then from there, what we'll do is we make a list of the regulatory items for the multi-state shipments with the revolving plant inventory. So we'll present identifying the correct regulatory match between the plant name and information. We like to call it our audit review summary, but we'll give the information for how the plants are going to best apply to the states that they're headed to from where they're coming from. How this helps the industry is that first, it's the first user-friendly regulatory approach for the industries to ensure compliant shipments of plants throughout intra and interstate operations. Usability is everything, and Plant Sentry is really the first model out there that provides a real easy accessibility to this audit information. The second way is that we give growers the option to work with sales vendors, state and federal officials, or ourselves confidentially to help bolster their consumer confidence as well as their sales. And third, we allow for the improved detail and ability to reach further than the growers had maybe initially projected by helping with online sales with real-time inventory management in the regulatory aspect. So, we like to say that Plant Sentry equals shipping safe and easy. We generate an easy list to be taken to state or federal officials. It's also easy to disperse amongst your team. The audit review information that we give you really comprehensively provides detailed pathways of what's going to be best for the plant inventory that you're looking to sell. Additionally, we direct the growers to areas of need in order to treat the plants effectively. So if they're new to a certain market and they're unfamiliar with the treatment protocols, we can provide advice with that as well. And most importantly is that we can provide the growers with the capability to eliminate invasive plant shipments before the purchase. This is really important to us as it really touches on what we identify as the 3 core values of attention in our auditing procedures. So as many invasive plant eliminations as we can make by acknowledging those regulations is what we're looking to accomplish. And then finally, we create a fun atmosphere between the growers, the officials, the third parties, and it helps build the consumer confidence. And at the end of the day, I think anyone selling plants is really looking for that. Okay, and then Tom, I'll pass it off to you.
Oh, you can go back 1 slide, please.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Welcome everybody. I'm Tom Buechel, Chief Compliance Officer for Plant Sentry. Just give you a quick brief history of what I do is I do a lot of the maintenance and interpretation of the actual 50 states regulations. It's not always the most exciting job in the world, but we do maintain that throughout the year to make sure that we are on top of our game and even ahead of the game, and especially in the case of invasive plants coming down the pipeline, that we're notifying our clientele that there's probably going to be some changes, and gives them adequate time to make the shift. Some sets limiting that phase, what we call that phase out period, so you don't get stuck with a lot of nursery stock or green goods for a lengthy period of time. This is a screen that basically can be used by our clientele that basically associates the plant check, that it's verified by the Plant Sentry system, that it is capable of being shipped to your state. We also can engage our clientele to block plant purchase, whether it's pest, disease, or invasive species related on the front end, as Rachel mentioned. And then also they can put an agricultural statement in there if it's an e-commerce site, to let them know that the reason why they cannot purchase that plant in their state because it may cause economic harm. Do a quick comparison of kind of the differentiation between Plant Sentry and other systems. There's a lot of things out there. There's environmentally and sustainable programs. There's production improvement programs. Everyone's probably heard of TQM at some point in time. But one of the things about systems approach type tools and programs is it gives you multiple methods of back checks in the system to make sure from an audit standpoint that you're doing your best job to make sure that you don't have any errors. So even within our maintenance protocols within Plant Sentry, we strive very, very hard to have those back checks in place to make sure that we're doing multiple checks in different areas and in different ways to make sure that we're basically eliminating things from happening and preventing them from happening, from plant pests or diseases or invasive plants shipping to states where they're not supposed to ship to. On the clientele standpoint, we also engage them to make sure they have the correct compliance agreements, and that even in the event that there's a questionable invasive species that might be county orientated or what like that, we are giving them a heads up to make sure that they're aware of that plant is, can cause potential problems or serious problems in that state, to try to look for something else to sell instead. Our approach involves multiple avenues of accountability, like we mentioned, internal verifying power, basically a lot of learning and training. We've seen this with all of our clientele. A lot of people are really new to compliance. They don't, and regulatory information, they don't understand it. And we help them learn the things that we're telling them that they really need to do. And it helps them over time kind of build a semi skill set. And it also allows them to focus on what they actually do best. We also have the external certifying power, and working with the states and regulatory officials, even in the event of emergency response, to make sure that we put closure to things as quickly as possible in the event something does happen or a plant gets shipped by mistake, which we're all human and it can happen. From the company perspective, on a grower side of things, or even on an e-commerce side of things, Plant Sentry does a great job of seeing countless hours of labor costs by basically essentially giving them the information they need to let them know where they cannot sell plants. It saves them a heck of a lot of time, allows them to focus on what they do best: grow plants, ship plants, market plants, and obviously sell them. It's a very clear organization and up to date the way we do things. It's very, very, very helpful that we stay on top of it. So we have a tremendous amount of process in place all the time, and we stick to it. And over time, where we do see errors or we see things that aren't working, we do continually improve those. And it also helps enables a knowledgeable staff to complete the regulatory efforts accurately, like I mentioned before, because there's a lot of people that are just really, really inexperienced with this, and they don't understand it, and they end up doing something they shouldn't be doing. And we typically catch them on the front end instead of the back end, which helps. The heavy cost without using a tool and systems approach as ours, like Plant Sentry, is you're really operating blind. And I'll have to say, in this COVID environment this year, e-commerce sales or online sales are up exponentially, and they've grown on average at a very, very high rate over the last couple of years. And this year was no exception. Companies are jumping into it, thinking, it's an extra great way to diversify. And it's one of those deals where they don't think about compliance. It's one of the last things they think about are invasive species or invasive plants. And it's a dangerous game, because that's how things can spread in a real quick, rapid fashion with tens of thousands of boxes of plant material going out each and every day, and per week. So there's your reputation risk. Obviously, in social media, people call you out online when something isn't right, whether it's a quality issue, or even if they're seeing something on your website that they think you shouldn't be selling. So Plant Sentry enables you to come up with a great customer service program to be able to answer those questions very efficiently and effectively, to minimize things. We do a great deal in helping to limit, obviously, damages and fines. I think one of the biggest things is environmental impacts. We want to reduce that as much as possible and prevent it. And as we've seen so far with the system over the last couple of years, that it works tremendously well for people that are using it to really minimize and mitigate risk. Obviously, the fines, Indiana was a great example in Dawn's presentation, $500 per day per incident. There are fines, and of course, we all want to avoid that stuff. We want to do the right thing. And then there's plant sales. There's stop sales. One of the biggest things in our industry, or in the green industry, is plant or crop loss. That can happen whether it's pest related or whatnot. Plant Sentry actually helps get back if there is a pest related problem to the grower, so they can eliminate that problem. And of course, we're working with them well ahead of the game as we see things coming down the pipeline on the invasive species front, by really staying involved with a lot of different organizations and using other tools.
Right. So touching back on the preventative measures, which is really the focus of our entire business model, how invasive species and pest and disease and all of the things that Plant Sentry pays attention to implements the environment and our community and essentially our industry is something that we very much so and deeply acknowledge. With that, we really have been drawing attention and sharing our knowledge with both our clients as well as the customers that see Plant Sentry for the first time and have no idea what it is that we do or what we even are. And it's just to introduce people to why compliance is important and what the effects of compliance are in a positive aspect, outside of just the fines and the damage that you can accrue. There's just a lot of environmental and ecological information to be gained on how we can further benefit really everything for everyone. So we recognize that the compliance doesn't just come from the regulations, and it really does find a foundation in the it's not just in the regulations, but it finds a foundation in the education that is provided. So we really do try to put our best foot forward in letting the people that we come into contact with know as much as possible about why something is or is not a good idea as far as their sales are concerned and the environments that they're potentially impacting. Okay. And then we do have a focus on rebuilding our environment. For years, the green industry has really struggled to develop a market for native plant sales by volume. And with the green initiatives that are taking place with a focus on climate change and habitat loss and forest degradation, we're really seeing an increase of focus from consumers on the want and desire of native plant species for their homes, as well as restoration efforts within their communities. So as 2020 created a pivot of focus towards e-commerce, as Tom had mentioned previously, in the increase of online sales that we've seen, we recognize that this provides a unique opportunity to the native plant market. This could be an opportunistic solution for them. It is incredibly challenging, however, to navigate e-commerce, as Tom attributed to before. You run into a situation with a number of sellers who have never sold plants before, or they thought it would be a quick buck, or they're new to e-commerce. They've been doing this for years. And what we've seen is regulatory response from a number of states where Plant Sentry has been incredibly beneficial, not just in identifying the weak and strong pathways of where your plants should be headed, but also in how to navigate communication with those regulatory officials and identifying as a whole what your inventory could potentially look like for a state like that, as far as native plant species, as well as prevention of spreading unwanted contaminants to different parts of the country. So that's what I have. Tom, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that whether it's an e-commerce a grower client or just actually a wholesale grower client, the one interesting thing about our system that we found over the years dealing with all of the grower vendors is that about 99.9% of them have some kind of issue. They're not compliant in some way, shape, or form, whether it's on the invasive species front or whether it's on the pest or disease front. And there are pests that are invasive species, right? So, and diseases as well. So we kind of cover the whole gamut of that to try to prevent it. So no matter who it is using it, it is absolutely, it benefits them. On the native side of things, just quickly, where it really helps is you still have to deal with the pest and disease front on the natives front. And a lot of people want to deal with chemicals and things like that. Well, Plant Sentry actually helps you see those regions that you can actually move plants to without having a lot of issues or needing to do a lot of treatment protocols and things like that. That's the beauty of using the program overall. We have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, I'll do the Q&A for you guys. Not fair to make Rachel talk and be the moderator. Yeah, so do you have your URL handy so folks can read a little bit more about the company?
It's just plantcentury.com. I do have it in my bio on the UMISC page, but I don't have it in the presentation. I apologize, but just plantcentury.com. So I can go back all the way to the beginning here. Nice and big.
Definitely go to the website. I'll put a plug in for what Rachel does as a very valuable team member, doing a great job of blogs and social media and things like that. And there's some great educational stuff on there. And just to get the word out that, you know, anytime that anyone wants to share something, Plant Sentry is a great resource to get her information, so we can get it up and get it national. It's a great deal.
You're probably ahead of actually like native or invasive plant councils in general of having a comprehensive list of all 50 states' laws.
Yeah.
How do you do it? Like, how do you keep track of all that? How do you know when a state has a law?
Yeah, it's a daily job. So it's daily maintenance is what I call it. So we do monthly maintenance with all our clientele based inventories. And then I also do general maintenance of the system of the database. Just to give you an idea, there's over 100,000 regulatory items in the database. So it's a lot of material, but we stay ahead, like I said, by working with organizations and pre-tools and, you know, just going through and knowing where to get to the regulatory information. I don't like to give that information out, but how I actually do it, but I do it through multiple methods, even as far as social media and Facebook. Because some of the regulatory information operates by Facebook, some operates by emails, but it's really about staying ahead. And, you know, once you've got a base and a database, it makes it a lot easier to stay ahead of it versus, you know, always trying to look for things.
You mentioned like sometimes sending alerts at the county level. Are there many counties that regulate invasive plants on the local level?
Yeah, there is. We're just about out of time here, but yes, there is, and that one gets pretty hairy and confusing. But you know, you do have to worry about it because you get in places like the East Coast, and there's a lot of money out there, and you don't want to mess with an estate or anything like that where somebody has a lot of money. That can be worse than the regulatory side with fines. So it's one of those deals where you have to be very, very vigilant of it, no matter what.
We do have just a couple minutes time for one more. So if Plant Sentry flags a species as not allowed to be sold or shipped to a certain place, will it recommend any native plants or alternative plants?
That's a fair question and a good question. It really depends on the client, whether it's a grower vendor or actually a vendor that's actually selling plants, if they'll post alternatives. A lot of places will do that based on the information that we give them. We don't do that particularly for them. That's not our job. Our job is to get them the information to say, don't ship this plant to that place.
Gotcha. All right, well, thank you guys. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Self, as well. Okay, so now that we have spoke, next up is going to be David Zaya from Illinois Natural History Survey, and he is going to be presenting on mislabeling and hybridization, untangling invasive bittersweet from its native relative. All right, David, off to you.
Thank you. Can you see my screen, my presentation screen, okay?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Okay, great. Hello, I'm a plant ecologist at the Illinois Natural History Survey. Today I'll be speaking about work I did during my graduate studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And this was a collaborative effort with my co-authors, Stacy Light-Young and Noel Pavlovich of the USGS in Northwestern Indiana, and Chris Hetria and Mary Ashley from UIC, the U Illinois at Chicago. Ornamentals represent a substantial portion of the plant species that eventually become invasive. And that's especially the case for woody invasives. By one estimate, 85% of woody invasives in the US or North America started as ornamental plantings. And in order to prevent the planting of known invasives and potential new invaders, there's been an increased emphasis on planting native ornamentals. They also have the other natives also have the other advantages, such as being better adapted to the climate and providing habitat for wildlife. And as was discussed by Rachel and Thomas, there's also laws on the books in several states prohibiting the use of certain ornamental invasive. Here's an example from Illinois that includes several ornamental species. The list starts at the bottom of the page, and you see a bunch of them were originally ornamentals introduced to North America. However, from the horticultural perspective, there are several advantages to problematic non-natives, potentially. One is that many of the factors that make them invasive, such as fast growth and tolerance of human-modified habitats, make them easier to produce. And also, there may be a substantial amount of inertia because cultivars already exist, they're known by customers, and they're already potentially in large-scale production. And in some cases, maybe people just don't know the negative impacts of invasives, and also they might not know about regulation, which ties in pretty well with the Plant Sentry presentation we just saw. I'll be speaking today about one of these ornamental invasive species, Oriental Bittersweet, also known as Asian Bittersweet. This is a woody vine that can tolerate quite a range of conditions in terms of soil, light, and moisture. It has a long history in American horticulture, being first brought to the US from Japan in about the 1870s. And it grows very aggressively once established. You can see here on the left, it's girdling a young tree that'll soon be killed. This was, I saw this in northeastern Illinois. And on the right, this is at the Indiana Dunes National Park now. Those are 30-foot tall snags that were killed and then overgrown by Oriental Bittersweet. In the Northeast, I've seen kind of like huge 200-meter long patches, and it's almost like kudzu is in the Southeast, but not quite as bad as kudzu. That's something else. So this is a forest opening, and I don't know if you can tell, but everything has been blanketed in the foreground, in some of the background, by Oriental Bittersweet. And it can really change successional trajectories once it's established. That is, it changes the way that forests develops and kind of prevents forest development in sometimes quite large patches. Creates these openings where it blankets everything, cause tree falls, and then prevents new saplings from being established. This is a map showing the states and provinces where Oriental Bittersweet is known, although it's not quite up to date. A couple states are missing on this list. Fortunately, there is a potential alternative to Oriental Bittersweet for ornamental plantings, and it's American Bittersweet. It's a native woody vine. It's native to the US and Canada, east of the Rockies, in most of the states in the US east of the Rockies. And the fruit color and structure are a bit different than Oriental Bittersweet, but still quite attractive. It makes kind of these gorgeous orange clusters of fruits whose capsules pop open with first frost, and they reveal a red arrow surrounding the seed inside. So if you were to run into, at my latitude, if you were to run into American Bittersweet right now, you'd see these orange capsules have exploded, and there's a red, I mean, not exploded, but opened, and there's a red arrow, a red fleshy bit surrounding the seeds. And in Illinois, Oriental Bittersweet, going back to the invasive, was added to the list of exotic weeds that are restricted for sale. Here it is right here. It wasn't included in the original list, but was added, I think, in about 2014. Oriental Bittersweet's also a new invader in Minnesota, and they've been taking aggressive measures to control it, including listing it as a noxious weed. However, it does seem to be spreading. Someone from west of the Minnesota River just reached out to me with a new sighting, which is the furthest west I'm aware of in that state. Now, there's some special considerations for anyone who wants to use American Bittersweet instead of Oriental Bittersweet in horticulture or as an ornamental. First, Oriental Bittersweet is a well-established horticultural plant. Cultivars have been developed, they're named, some large suppliers are growing them, and the species grows much faster than American Bittersweet. Second, the two species can be difficult to distinguish. Let's see. Especially when they're young and have not reached reproductive maturity. If you're buying a plant, it's most likely in this stage. It's most likely not a mature gigantic plant. It's pretty small. You can hold it. Usually at that stage, they don't have fruits or flowers on them. And finally, hybrids are sometimes found in the wild. In a previous study, we found hybrid plants were not very abundant, but they were also not rare, and they were widespread. Pretty much everywhere that Oriental Bittersweet grows in North America, you can find a hybrid somewhere. So to get at the heart of what I'm trying to accomplish here, I wanted to know, are vendors selling Oriental Bittersweet and calling it American Bittersweet, or could they be selling hybrids? To answer the questions confidently and quickly, I used genetic markers. This way I could identify non-reproductive plants. And we purchased plants from 12 vendors, though I was only able to get data from 11 of them. The purchases were made online and in person. In total, there were 34 individual plants genetically tested. And in all cases, they were marketed as either American Bittersweet or Celastrus scandens, the Latin name for the species. The purchases were made across the Midwest, but mostly in Illinois. And in order to calibrate my genetic markers and also make sure they were working, I used control samples from wild-grown plants, which I knew the species identity for. I knew it because they had flowers or fruits on them. And also I used some known hybrids that we hand-crossed and grew from seed. The genetic markers we used were nuclear microsatellites. These are useful because they can easily distinguish species and also because they are codominant. For our purposes, that means they can distinguish hybrids from parental species. And two general types of statistical analyses were run. The findings for these analyses were the same, although I'll only be presenting the results from one of them for simplicity's sake. And here are the results of the principal components analysis. And I'll break this down. The red dots here are plants that I knew were American Bittersweet. The blue dots are plants that I knew were Oriental Bittersweet. The purple triangles, those are plants that I knew were hybrids. You can see that they all cluster with their own kind. All the red dots are on this side, the blue dots on this side, and the purple ones in the middle. So it suggests that the genetic markers in this analysis are able to distinguish the species and their hybrids. And the yellow dots are the 34 plants that I purchased from the various vendors. You can see that some cluster with American Bittersweet and some with Oriental Bittersweet, and none of them were hybrids. So none of the yellow dots fell in the middle with the purple triangles. In total, I found slightly more Oriental Bittersweet than American Bittersweet in my samples. Keep in mind that these were all supposed to be American Bittersweet or Celastrus scandens. There was a noticeable difference in the accuracy of labeling between in-person and online purchases. And, building off of the previous presentation, this is especially problematic because online purchases have greater potential for long distance dispersal and potentially much greater volume this day and age. And, if you go online now and you search American Bittersweet in Amazon, the first hit, that looks like American Bittersweet to me. The second one, that's definitely Oriental Bittersweet. So a little hobby is on occasion, I'll just search on Amazon for American Bittersweet, and everything that has a picture of Oriental Bittersweet, I'll just review with a negative review and a comment about it being the wrong species. That's staying busy during the pandemic, And there's also a noticeable and statistically significant difference in the prices of the two species. The natives, the correctly labeled natives, were on average more than twice as expensive as the mislabeled invasives. And this creates an incentive for buying non-natives even for well-meaning gardeners. In terms of cultivar names, almost all were actually Oriental Bittersweet. And it was interesting, this Diana and Hercules, that's supposed to be, they're dioecious, that means the male and females are in separate, flowers are in separate plants, were genetically pretty much identical to the inappropriately named Indian Brave and Indian Maiden. So someone just switched the name on them. And of the name varieties, only one was American Bittersweet. That was Autumn Revolution. This is a bit of a strange strain, though. The plants are more robust than your typical American Bittersweet. I don't know if that makes them more potentially aggressive in the wild. I'm not sure, but there's definitely a visible difference. And more importantly, they have perfect flowers. That is, both male and female parts are in the same flower. Native American Bittersweet almost always is dioecious. So not only are the flowers, male and female parts on separate flowers, they're on separate plants. So this is a bit of a shift in reproductive biology. Only one vendor, so in addition to the Autumn Revolution, which was native, only one vendor sold American Bittersweet without a varietal name, and that was in northeastern Illinois. So I'll leave you with some guidance on distinguishing the species. The easiest way to tell them apart is to look at the fruits on the female plants or flowers on either male or female plants in the spring. In American Bittersweet, you have this large cluster of flowers, this panicle at the end, at the terminal end of the stem. So it's called a terminal panicle. In Oriental Bittersweet, you have these smaller clusters of groups of 2 or 3 called cymes, and they come out of the leaf bases and occur all up and down the stem. So whereas one stem on American Bittersweet will have one cluster of fruits or flowers, on Oriental Bittersweet will be the potential for a lot more. And I've found in different studies that they're floral and seed output is much higher than American Bittersweet. Oh, and this here is a picture of a hybrid that has both. So it has a terminal panicle, this is a female, terminal panicle and the axillary cymes. This is just a few axils, leaf axils, but it goes all up and down the stem. There is a difference in the color of the fruit capsule, but both species can be intermediate. So on the left, you have the classic orange American Bittersweet. On the right, the yellow Oriental Bittersweet. But both species can kind of blur towards the center. And actually, these capsules are from that reproductive hybrid in the previous slide. So the hybrids have kind of intermediate orange capsules. So in conclusion, most vendors and most plants had the wrong label. I didn't find any hybrids for sale, and if you really want American Bittersweet, you have a better chance if you speak to people in person, and even if you're going to buy it online, which it's hard to buy things in person now. I really recommend you, I don't know, pick up the phone or send a comment, and just ask if they understand the issue and if they care. You know, I found that goes a long way. If you find mislabeled plants, I've had a really hard time talking to the companies, and they just deny and question my expertise. And then if you call authorities, things go pretty slow. I've found that the most effective thing is to just get a hold of people and have them reach out, you know, potential customers in essence, and have them reach out to the company and tell them this isn't right and we recognize it. Oh yeah. Also, some vendors do care, but are still selling Oriental Bittersweet. I think because they're being misled by their suppliers is what I've found. So thank you for your time. I'd like to acknowledge the funders of this work and the many people who helped us. And if I have time, I'd love to take questions.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, David. We do have a couple of questions. We're really tight on time. We've got about 3 minutes left. So I will start with the questions from Claire, and they are addressed to you. How did you pick where to buy the plants from?
So it was basically all the vendors we could get a hold of that had it. We ended up calling something like 85 vendors. And at the time, only about 13 or so had it, and we got plants from 12 of them. Okay.
I did really enjoy, by the way, that you just check out Amazon to see what plants are and are not. I thought that was very good, kind of funny. The second question that we have is, are there ways to distinguish hybrid plants in the wild without genetic testing?
Only if they have flowers or fruits on them. And the best thing to do is to look for the combination of a big clump of flowers at the end, like American Bittersweet, and smaller clumps all up and down the stem coming out of the bases of the leaves.
Okay. Another question, are you able to distinguish bittersweet species by their leaves, such as male plants? You kind of just attributed to that, but a little bit more specifically.
If you take very detailed measurements of the leaves, so it's not looking at it, it's like taking measurements, you can distinguish them according to a paper from about 10 years ago, 80% of the time.
Okay.
So,
and then,
not perfect.
Yep. Okay. And then we have one more question, and this one's from Tom Buechel. And his question was, sorry, I have to back up a little bit. He wanted to know if you included the Celastrus locinarii. The plants are both bad in his opinion, but he was curious if you included that as well.
I didn't run into any, I didn't find any locinarii for sale. If I remember correctly, there was 1 or 2 vendors where I was out of stock. This has been some years, so could have been fewer or more, but it was out of stock and I've never seen it in the wild. I've seen it at arboretums and things, but never in the wild.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, David. Oops. Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I just wanted to hop in. There was a question about what's a good source, like a renowned source in the Midwest for native plants. So actually this session is sponsored by Alpha Nurseries based out of Michigan. They ship to the whole Midwest, certainly to the Northeast, and they do a really good job selling a pretty broad variety of native plants. Yeah, they're great. Alpha Nurseries. Bye-bye.
Nope, that's perfect. That's great. Alpha Nurseries Inc. from Holland, Michigan. Again, they did sponsor this segment. So, all right. So the next speaker is going to be Mark Brand from the University of Connecticut, and he is going to be speaking with us about sterile cultivars, a plant breeding approach to invasive species problems. All right, take it away, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much. So my job today, I guess, is to try to explain some of the different approaches that people are using to breed non-invasive forms of invasive species. And the outcome that we're hoping for is that we will take these invasive forms. Let me just get this full screen here, and then throw them out. And that's what I'm doing in this picture here is taking a Japanese barberry cultivar Rose Glow, which is known to produce too many seeds, and giving it a heave. And so hopefully that's what we'll get to. You know, kind of the question at hand is, why would we want to breed sterile forms of invasive species? And the reason, I guess, rather than just straight up, you know, get rid of the plant, we don't need it, is many of these invasive ornamental plants have a lot of characteristics that make them also good landscape plants. So the same things that make them invasive can make them good landscape plants, especially in light of global warming and all the pressures that plants are getting these days, and we're losing plants due to a variety of reasons. They're tough, adaptable plants. They perform, you know, well in managed landscapes. Most of them are highly ornamental. Sometimes they're also deer resistant. And many times the alternative plants that we would like to use instead don't measure up. And I also work quite a bit with native species, trying to promote them. And some are really good and others just don't quite cut it sometimes. So in my mind, and probably in others as well, once you develop a sterile cultivar of an invasive plant, what the outcomes generally are going to be is that there'll be a drop in resistance to bands of fertile forms of the species. And, you know, so that's within sort of the plant producer world. And then also they will then stop growing the old fertile cultivars. So if you have, you know, fertile crimson pygmy, that's been the barberry you've been growing. And now you have a sterile alternative like crimson cutie that basically functions the same in the landscape but is non-invasive, you're going to switch to that new plant and avoid all the complications that come with this plant with seeds. All right, so do we have sterile cultivars on the market now? And actually there's a surprising number, and it's growing pretty rapidly these days. So I've just listed some of them here: Japanese barberry, Japanese spirea, the maiden grass or Miscanthus sinensis, privets, lantana, butterfly bushes, rose of Sharon, pennisetum or fountain grasses, and even calorie pear or Pyrus caloriane, or actually there's some hybrids, but they look and act, you know, in the landscape like a calorie pear. I'm sure I've missed some here, but that's just a, you know, a rough idea. And some other biggies that are still in development: Norway maple, Amur and Tatarian maple, and winged euonymus. And I expect there'll be many more coming on the scene in the coming decade or so. All right, so how do plant breeders make these sterile cultivars? I've listed out 5 ways it can be done. There probably are some other methods that are don't play a big role, but the first 3 are the ones that most people are using. So triploid plants, making plants that have 3 sets of chromosomes. These are generally infertile. 2 ways you can do it. You can cross a tetraploid with 4 sets by a diploid with 2 sets, and you get offspring with 3 sets. So you get your triploids, or you can regenerate plants from the endosperm found in seeds, which is naturally triploid tissue. Another very popular method is number 2, inducing mutations. So you can basically enhance the frequency of mutation or increase the mutation rate. And you can do this with chemicals or nuclear radiation and get more mutant plants to look at that might be useful. Third one's also very often used, interspecific hybridization. With interspecific hybridization, you're crossing 2 or more species within the same genus to produce progeny. And when you mix a number of species together or highly different species within the same genus, you often end up with sterile plants. The fourth one, production of haploids. If you can make haploids, they are generally going to be sterile. And then the last one, more for the future, CRISPR gene editing to make plants sterile, or even transgenic plants. But the CRISPR has a lot of potential. It's not really there yet for ornamental plants for the most part, but I think down the road it could play an important role. All right, so the first one there, crossing tetraploid by diploid genotypes. First thing you have to do is make your tetraploids, assuming you're working with a plant that's normally diploid. So you use mitotic inhibitors such as colchicine or oryzolin to double the chromosomes and get your tetraploid plant. And you do this most often by either treating shoot meristems, or I like to use seeds if that's possible. They generally give you a higher yield. So you treat those with the mitotic inhibitors, get your putative tetraploids, confirm their ploidy with flow cytometry. So it's just a technique where you get nuclei out of the plant and you put them through this machine, and it basically quantifies how much DNA is in the cells. Once you have known or verified tetraploids, you make your cross between the diploid or a good diploid and the tetraploid that you've made, and you'll hopefully get triploid plants. And with the extra copy of chromosomes, typically this leads to infertility, especially in triploids or pentaploids where you have an unbalanced number of chromosomes. So this is what this might look like. This is with barberry that I worked with. On the left, flower and the stems, we have diploid barberry. On the right, tetraploid. So with tetraploids, you typically see larger features, bigger flowers, larger leaves, and so on. And this is what the flow cytometry output might look like. On the top is the diploid with the diploid peak here at about 220, and then a tetraploid, you get a peak at double that at 440. And when you get these peaks, you know you've got a diploid or a tetraploid. So it kind of firms it up for you. Ideally, you would also do visualization of the chromosomes and count chromosomes. That's not always as easy as you'd like it to be. And so sometimes in breeding, you just go with flow cytometry until you get to the end product. All right, so these are some sterile barberries that were produced in my lab. They've been introduced. They're offered by Synergy nurseries called worry-free barberries. These actually are tetraploids. In our process of developing tetraploids to make triploids, we got hundreds of tetraploids, screened them all, and some of the tetraploids were quite infertile. So there's 2 yellows, a really dwarf one, a medium dwarf one, a compact green, and a compact red or purpley form. And when you have these sterile plants, they may or may not produce fruit. If they do produce fruit, usually this is what you see, the embryos or the seeds inside the fruits abort at some point during development, and you get no seeds, whereas the normal diploid type produces copious amounts. All right, so just some examples of plants that are on the market that have been produced through this process. Now with the barberry, barberries have what's called a triploid block. They don't like to exist in the triploid form, so they resist that. That's why we initially had sterile tetraploids. We finally broke through, and we now have been able to produce 8 triploids. This is all of them here in this cold frame in the upper left. This one in the foreground on the left side is the one that we've decided to move forward with. And to make that triploid, we had a tetraploid variety Atropurpurea, crossed it with a diploid crimson pygmy, and got seedlings. This miscanthus grass in the middle, out of North Carolina State University and Tom Rainey's work. This is another 4N by 2N, so 4N seedling of little zebra was crossed with a 2N seedling of little zebra and produced this triploid plant called bandwidth. And also out of NC State, this calorie pair replacement called Chastity was produced by making auto tetraploid Pyrus caloriana and then crossing it with actually a different hybrid pair, Pyrus silverball, and that produced a triploid plant that's proven to be sterile. So quite a few plants using the make a tetraploid and then cross it back to a diploid root. The other way you can get a triploid is in the seed. When you get double fertilization, one of the sperms from the pollen grain fertilizes the zygote, the egg to make the embryo, to make the diploid embryo, and then another germ cell from the pollen grain pollinates or double fertilizes 2 polar nuclei to give you triploid endosperm tissue. So this white tissue around the embryo, that's the nutritive tissue that helps feed the developing embryo. It's naturally triploid, and so we can go in and try to get plants to regenerate from that triploid tissue. And so here, this has been done with Euonymus elatus, although the plants are still being evaluated. Colleague of mine at UConn has done that work. So here's the diploid embryo, the endosperm in white is tetraploid. You excise that out, you grow callus, you regenerate shoots through shoot organogenesis, you root them, and then you have a triploid plant. Only works well with plants that have large endosperm. That's not all of them, it's endospermic seed plants. Things that have just large cotyledons don't have a lot of endosperm, and it's hard to isolate. But it does work and has worked with Euonymus, or appears to have worked. The mutation route has produced a number of plants. It's just as popular almost as making triploids. So if you use chemical mutagenesis, most often people are using ethyl methane sulfonate, EMS, which switches out base pairs in the DNA to make mutations. This particular Japanese barberry was produced by treating seeds from variety Atropurpurea with this EMS chemical and then screening a number of seedlings, and they found one that was sterile. With Pennisetum, this plant known as etouffee, fountain grass, is sterile and was produced by exposing seeds to gamma radiation from a cobalt-60 source, germinating them, and then some of the seedlings that were exposed to the radiation were sterile. The third rather popular method is wide interspecific hybridization, where you cross different species together, and when you have disparate species mixed together in a plant, it often causes them to be sterile. So there's a barberry example here. The female was Chenaltii, which is Gangnapenii bivarieculosa crossed to Thunbergii, and then the male was Thunbergii vulgaris. So you had 1, 2, 3, 4 species combined into that plant. It made them sterile. With this sterile privet, the female was Ovalifolium vulgari, and the male parent was Chinoskii. So 3 different species went into that, turned out to be sterile. And then with this Buddleia called, lo and behold, Blue Chip. The female was Davidii by globosa, and then the male was Davidii variety nanhoensis by Lindleyana. And so you have 3.5 mixed together there. So that method is used quite a bit as well. This is work that we did in my lab with Buddleia, trying an alternative route to make sterile Buddleia by producing haploids or dihaploids. So Buddleia is a natural tetraploid. So just naturally it exists as a tetraploid. And there are a lot of species like that, way more than they teach you in your biology classes. So it's a natural tetraploid. And what we did was we gamma irradiated the pollen to essentially kill the nucleus, but then we still used that irradiated pollen to pollinate one of these tetraploid plants. And what it does is it triggers seed formation without the female gamete being fertilized. So you basically get a seed to form just from the maternal tissue. And it was successful. We developed 4 or 5 plants through this technique. So here's normal tetraploid Buddleia, and here's the dihaploid that resulted. They were 100% sterile. The problem is Buddleia doesn't really like growing with only half of its chromosomes, so they were kind of wimpy plants, not real robust, and we didn't end up introducing any of those, but it worked. All right, so I'm getting close to the end here. You have to thoroughly test your sterile plants, confirm ploidy. You have to make sure you put your putative cultivars out with the appropriate controls for cross-pollination. You need multiple genotypes, including variable ploidy levels. You have to let them become old enough, and then you have to test germination. So when we tested our barberries, we put one of our plants out in the field. These here are the crimson cuties, coupled with red streamers, our regular crimson pygmies mixed in the row, and all these barberries around. We had 45 genotypes of different barberries, tetraploids and diploids, and allowed them to go to town. And then we tested over a large number of years. We only started when plants were 6 years old, had them established in the field for a couple of years, and then followed them for several years to ensure that they were sterile. And that's what I think should be done. I'm just going to skip over this one and get to this last slide since I'm running close to the end. These are some things that I think have to be considered if we're going to be looking at sterile plants. One, there's a belief or notion out there with most people that sterile plants are going to revert. And this is based primarily on things that happen with calorie pear or mordant pink lithrum. But the problem is those plants which were claimed to be sterile were never sterile in the first place. They were simply self-incompatible. Once you got other genotypes around to cross-pollinate, they showed their true fertile cells. We also have to be able to ensure that only sterile genotypes will be grown. People are concerned that people will slip crimson pygmy fertile barberries in with, say, crimson cutie, which are sterile. But things are patented, licensed to certain growers, sold with special tags and pots. And so hopefully that can be regulated. And then the last thing we absolutely need to have is exemptions in plant bans to allow for sterile cultivars. It's worked well in Oregon with Buddleia. They've got a program, they've got approved sterile cultivars. And from everything I hear from the folks in Oregon, the system has worked well and has done the job. So if legislation's being passed to ban plants, it's good to give consideration for the potential of sterile cultivars down the road. All right, so I think I'm close to the end, maybe a minute or so left.
You've got exactly about a minute or so left. We've got probably like a minute and 30 seconds technically. So really quick here, there are a couple of questions. I think what I'm going to go with is, Claire had sent us a question on how many seasons of flowering seed set evaluation are necessary to be confident in labeling a plant as sterile.
Well, it's a good question. I don't know if there's a one definitive answer, but I would be most comfortable with, something along the lines of 5 to 6 years of evaluation with really, old mature plants.
Okay.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time left, so I'm gonna hold off on the additional questions. And if we have time at the end of the next presentation and people are okay with a little bit extended Q&A, I'd love to ask you the rest of them because I think we did have some really good questions here for you. Okay, but thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. That was a great presentation. The final speaker that we have is Katie Grzesiak, and she is from Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network. She will be giving a speech on Go Beyond Beauty, Northwest Michigan's approach to invasive ornamentals. So with that, I'll pass it off to you, Katie.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay.
And I can see your slides too.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. As Rachel said, my name is Katie Grzesiak, and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network, and I'm here to talk with you a little bit about Go Beyond Beauty. So moving away from regulation and into kind of more programmatic stuff. The Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network, or ISN, is a SISMA. We cover 4 counties in northern lower Michigan in the Grand Traverse region, Benzie, Grand Traverse, Leelanau, and Manistee. We have tons of partners. They're really fantastic. We're super appreciative of them. They've definitely put us where we are today. And we're almost entirely grant funded through the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and the Good Neighbor Authority. So to start right off with a little bit of background about what Go Beyond Beauty is, where it came from, I have to start first with a little bit of background on Michigan. Michigan does not have very many regulations about ornamental invasive species. We regulate purple loosestrife and autumn olive and Japanese knotweed, and it kind of feels like that's it. And so we run into a lot of problems with invasive species being planted completely legally and causing a lot of problems in our natural areas. And we have a really, really strong nursery industry that has a strong lobby, in addition to some pretty yucky situations with previous legislative actions where the garden industry felt left out, and there's just a whole big mess. And so we moved forward thinking from a much more grassroots situation because we knew that legislation wasn't forthcoming. So in 2012, we got a grant, a different Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant. And part of, just like a small part of that grant, was communicate with garden professionals about invasive species. And so we started with some research looking into some of the other programs throughout the country, learning more about the invasive species laws in Michigan, looking into passing some local ordinances at county level and township level, and helped some of our townships to pass those, learning more about eco-labeling, and then just reached out to our local professionals, asked them about a huge list of species, what they thought about them, whether or not they sold them, whether or not they would be interested in not selling them. And it was all just a survey. And that was kind of it. That was where it was supposed to end. But instead, we got creative, and we moved into creating this program called Go Beyond Beauty. And so instead of just reaching out and kind of trying to educate garden professionals, this became a focus on local businesses agreeing not to sell high priority invasive species beyond what the law said. So these folks were putting their bottom line on the line to say, hey, we're doing the best thing for our natural areas. And we worked really hard to make it worthwhile to our participants. First of all, it was free, because if they're putting their bottom line on the line, we probably shouldn't be charging them to participate. And then one of the biggest incentives that we had was publicity. We give presentations all the time, we have printed materials, and so we wanted to put that out there, creating education and resources both for them and their customers. And one of the really interesting things that we didn't really expect, but became really valuable as the program grew, was the collaboration within the group. When we would get together for a meeting, we would all talk about Go Beyond Beauty stuff, but then they would also go off and say, hey, what if we did a bulk order to save on shipping, because a bunch of us are really small, and so the shipping is killing us. We can't get some of these cool plants that aren't invasive, but if we all pool together, we can do that, sharing ideas. And it's just been a really, really exciting thing that has happened since then. So we started off with 6 nurseries and garden centers and 5 landscapers. We were originally just focusing on the nurseries, but it turns out that the landscapers, it was a lot easier for them to pivot because they don't have the standing stock. So you'll see that still today we have more landscapers than nurseries. We just had some laminated signs, a couple of stickers, a little meeting once a year, and we created this Plan Before You Plant brochure that is an alternatives brochure, like, oh, if you have Japanese barberry, consider instead 9-bark, and that kind of thing, just pictures, but we put an insert in there that had all of these participants' names on there. And so a quick list of our high priority invasive species. You can see that there's a whole bunch of them on there. We were trying to hit both the high priority species that are already here, as well as some early detection species. And the ones that really apply to WIGL are the Japanese barberry, common and glossy buckthorns, and Callery and Bradford pear. And these were the ones that we had the most sticking points with, and especially Japanese barberry is one that it's like a cash crop for a lot of our businesses, and to not sell that one was hard. So we were really, really excited to have folks who said, you know what, it's still worth it for us to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So we've grown a lot over the years. It's so surprising to me still to say years, but our participants expressed a lot of things as we have grown. And one of those things was a desire for resources. We started off with a couple of signs, and then they said, hey, we have people asking about Japanese barberry, and like, we know in our head what it is, but sometimes we're busy, we just can't think of it. Could you make us a rat card? So, we had a card there that they could just hand to people when folks had questions. We had a nursery come to us and say, hey, it's wintertime and we want to drive a little extra business. We have a greenhouse and we'd love to have you come and give a presentation and, drive business to our business and also do education. So it was a real win-win for both of us. We improved our signage and created some native plant signs as well to kind of encourage, whenever they were selling native plants, to give them a little up, because we learned through our research that signing something as native actually made people more willing to pay a little bit more for it. And so we were trying to help them out with their business a bit. Participants also expressed a desire for recognition. So almost right away, we started recognizing those that were selling more than 20 native plants. And we started connecting. A lot of our partners have native plant sales in the spring. Our non Go Beyond Beauty partners, like conservation districts and stuff, have these native plant sales. And so connecting those native plant sales, oh, did you not find what you wanted? Well, these local nurseries have native plants all year round. We also broadened our participant base. Like I said, we added landscapers, but then we also had just people in the community, whether it was gardens that were maintained by master gardeners, or businesses that had, a small landscape out front, and they said, we want to be recognized for not having invasive species as well. So we opened it up into our community participants. But our regular participants said, what if we want to go above and beyond even the Go Beyond Beauty program? And so we've opened up options for trainings for their staff, with an annual fee to give them like a star on their sign. And we tried charging a flat rate so that they could bring all of their employees rather than just a couple. We didn't charge per person. If they remove additional invasive species that aren't on our no-no list, they become a champion. And then we also offered site visits and audits just to kind of give them, again, that extra oomph of what they're doing for our natural areas. So from our 6 nurseries, we've now grown a bit, which is really exciting. And those butterflies mean species that or businesses that sell at least 20 species. And we now have, we're so excited, in the last couple of years, we've got 2 nurseries that sell only native plants, which is so exciting because as folks are interested in native plants, it's nice to be able to guarantee that there are a couple of businesses that have those. But of course, even if they're just not selling invasive species, that's exactly what we want. And then our landscaper list grows and grows. And the reason that there's these 2 here on the side that are just written in is because they just joined in the last couple of weeks. And so this is a section of Go Beyond Beauty that grows all the time, as well as our community members, that when we get somebody new all the time, and it's just so exciting to have people to be able to celebrate the choices that folks are making. Another thing that participants expressed to us is that they had a desire for action. They didn't want to just say, oh yeah, we're not selling those plants and that's really cool. They wanted to be seen as the leaders in the community. And so we had work bees where these, garden professionals came and helped us murder invasive species in natural areas. They expressed support when local invasive species ordinance were proposed. They said, yes, this is important. We're not selling these species. And we think that also, businesses shouldn't be planting these as a part of development. And one of the biggest things we did was creating a Japanese barberry trade up. So people would bring us their Japanese barberry, would throw it in a dumpster and dispose of it carefully. And then we would give them coupons to the participating nurseries so that they could get a replacement plant at a lower cost. Sorry about that. And this was really exciting. It drove business to our nurseries, and it also just created a real big stir, because so often folks ask us, what do I do about this? And we're like, be careful with it, get rid of it, it'd be really great. So creating this system hasn't yet created a desire for people to grow their own barberry for the trade up, because our coupons are only $5. So it's not like you're really making money on this. Thinking about the future, we are really excited to announce that we got a 3-year grant from the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program to bring this program statewide. We've had questions about this almost since we started, with people saying, oh my gosh, we want to bring this to this place, or could we do it here? And we've always said, no, because we were worried about, copywriting or just kind of mission creep. And so with this grant, we feel confident that we're going to be able to spread the message in a responsible way. We hired a Go Beyond Beauty specialist. We're so excited to have her on board. We're working collaboratively with partners throughout the state, and we're hoping to use other groups like ISN, maybe other SISMAs or other just more local areas as like a hub, so that we can empower them to have these really close connections with the businesses, because that's one of the things that's been successful for us, is working closely with the businesses. And yeah, we'll have an advisory committee that we're just getting started on, so we're really excited. Some of the stumbling blocks that we've come into, we do have a pretty long list of species, particularly because the Michigan regulations are so few. I just pulled up this WIGL map, which, by the way, this is an incredible resource. But for common buckthorn, everybody's regulating it but us in Pennsylvania. And it can be really frustrating. So that makes our list a lot longer. Of course, funding is always a problem. It's been a bit, sometimes I think this might be kind of a personal thing, is it's so easy to get excited about native plants that we have to remember that no, the actual point of this program is to reduce invasive species, to do that prevention part. So don't get too excited about the native plants, Katie. And then we had some stumbling blocks about folks who said, oh gosh, I'd really love to do this, but because I have this standing stock, I can't. And we said, oh, we understand, bottom line is bottom line. But then we did get a grant at one point to do a buyback, to say, hey, we'll buy those back at cost so that you won't lose money on it. And then, then you'll have a clean slate and you can be a participant. And they all said, nah. And so that was really, really surprising for us and disappointing. Big box stores were another one. We're just covering 4 counties. And so when we approached Lowe's and Home Depot and Meijer, and we said, hey, what about not selling these species? They said, talk to corporate. And we went, woof, that sounds like way more work than we can take on. We may be readdressing that as we move statewide. But when we were just focused on 4 counties, it was like, never mind. And then, of course, as I said before, we have some really strong green industry in Michigan who are very not cool with regulation in particular, but also not that into us trying to create grassroots movements. We've had some folks who've tried to start their own programs in different part of the state who've had legislation or not legislation, legal action threatened on them if they proceeded. And so not the coolest of environments at times, but we're hoping that moving forward with it in the way that we can all work together because, you know, Michigan's really special and we want to take good care of it. So that wraps up my talk, and I would love if there are any questions to address them.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Katie. I don't. Any advice for starting a program like this in other states?
I think the biggest advice for starting is to reach out to your local businesses. I think something that worked really well for us is the fact that we were able to start in just our 4 counties and really build those relationships and see like what people were and weren't willing to move on. So, you know, Japanese barberry was one that people were willing to move on with some encouragement, but ground covers, for example, are currently in our champion program. So things like periwinkle or myrtle vinca, sweet woodruff and English ivy that are a real big problem. We said, okay, let's talk about those in a way where like, if you have those near your house, they may not be a problem. They're a big problem in our woods, and like, please don't compost them. So making having those conversations with people to figure out where they are has really enabled us to be successful, I think. And so that would be my biggest suggestion.
That's great. Thank you. Another question that we have is, where has the majority of your funding come from besides your most recent grant?
Funding for Go Beyond Beauty started with a Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant through the EPA. And I haven't seen any of those in a while. So it's been kind of a bummer. But that is where it started from. And then we've just kind of, once the program was established, we had several years where it was just kind of like part of our operations. And so we had funding coming a little bit from all of those funders that I mentioned, the GLRI, from the Forest Service, from our Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program. Everybody was just kind of funding a little part of that because it was a little part of what we did. And now bringing it big again is a full grant.
That's awesome. Okay, so another question that we have, you probably have, I think maybe the most time out of all of the speakers that we've had so far in this session. Where, or in your program, do you consider nativars, developed cultivars of natives as natives that are labeled as natives?
So this is something that we have kind of stepped back on. When we started the program, we said only true native species are native plants, no nativars. And it turned out that was really hard. It was hard for folks to find those. It was, or harder for some of our businesses to find those. And it was harder to like talk with them about, because they honestly a lot of times just weren't sure about what was and wasn't native. And so we stepped back and said, you know what, nativars are fine. We would so rather see nativars than invasive species, and we would definitely still celebrate them. And so that's where we've come to on that, is just allowing those and being fine with it.
That's awesome. Okay. And it makes a lot of sense, I think. Do you have any ideas? This was another question that we got, is do you have any ideas why Michigan is so reluctant to regulate invasive species?
So what I can tell you is a little bit of hearsay, because I was still in high school. Wait, no, I was in undergrad. But when they first passed an invasive species law in Michigan, it actually included a lot of species, and I believe Japanese barberry was one of them, a lot more of these species. But the way I understand it, and please fact check me on this, people in the world, the way I understand it is that the nursery industry was not consulted. And we do have a really strong green industry. And so this law passed, and suddenly, you know, you've got 40 billion plants that now you can't sell, and they're illegal. And so there was a huge pushback. A bunch of species were stripped out of the law. And then there was a coup. Like there's a lot of just basically soap opera that happened. And so that has made everything move into a really much more shaky place. I'm hoping again with this grassroots movement and trying to be very inclusive and celebratory rather than regulatory, that we can move past that era a little bit and maybe get some regulations, because a couple more, there's a good middle ground. We don't have to regulate every single thing, but some would be nice.
I think that that's a really unique perspective, considering a lot of what the beginning of this session looked like, where we were really addressing a lot of the regulatory initiatives around invasive species and native planting, where I like that inclusive approach. That's unique, and that it's really special. So
I mean, I wouldn't be mad if there were more regulations, but we're going to focus on our grassroots.
But given your guys' history, I think it makes sense to want to be inclusive. That's amazing. And I'm glad that your program has been very successful. So with that, Claire?
Yeah, do others want to turn their cameras on? I have a couple, we're going to go just a few minutes over. We'll try and keep it to 3:15 at the latest.
Okay.
I am going to make a couple housekeeping announcements just so people see. So I added some stuff that I think is all on the main menu. One is our evaluation for the summit, which continues tomorrow. So if you're going to be here tomorrow, don't fill it out today, but it is there. And then number two was a lot of links from this morning. I know particularly Randy Morin had a lot of links that people were interested in. I had some tool links. Those are now all in one place, so you can get to them. I think that's it. Did I promise something else? I don't think so. Mostly those two things. All right. So it's probably going to be easiest if I just pull some questions out from the back end of that movie. I know one for David is, do you have any advice for either regulators or for nurserymen and women when they're dealing with bittersweet plants that are in that juvenile phase and are like, how do you identify the native from the invasive in the juvenile phase?
It's tricky, and the best thing is leaf out in spring. So not when there's a new leaf in the middle of the year, in the middle of the growing season, but just in spring, which occurs here in late April and early May. It's the shape of the unrolling leaf out of the bud. It will either be folded or rolled, like two rolls. And there's that window, like a 1 or 2 week window in spring, where you can see that on like in all plants, and that can distinguish the species. And that's not easy to do. You have to get the timing right, and you have to look at some really small things.
And which one's folded and which one's rolled?
You're putting me on the spot. The native is rolled and the invasive is folded.
Awesome, thank you. Just looking through the questions again. I know there was another one for Mark. Can sterile cultivars produce pollen that would fertilize other plants?
Well, it depends on the particular sterile plant. Some plants are both female and male sterile, and then there are others that are female sterile but still seem to produce some viable pollen. So for some of them, I think the answer is it's possible for pollen to travel from the sterile genotype to others. Is that what the question was asking?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I think the pollen going from the sterile to the non. Okay.
Yeah, that question comes up fairly regularly. People, I guess, are concerned about, gene flow from the sterile to existing invasive plants out in the wild. But I'm not sure how much impact that necessarily has but it is a possibility, yeah.
I just saw a couple of questions asking about where things are found in the event space. I am going to screen share that because our attendees today, many of them are new to the space. So here I am on the page. This looks a little bit different for me than it does for you because I have more UMISC stuff, but this is the summit evaluation. It should appear basically just below the announcements for most WIGL attendees. And then these should be familiar to you. WIGL links. That's the new one. That's not just linked to the WIGL site, but all the different stuff I have pulled out of Randy's presentation. Actually, his whole PowerPoint, he sent it to me. I put in the WIGL summit document. So that's where those are on your menu. Okay, and then I saw another question for Katie. Any suggestion, or for anyone that works with native plants, any suggestions for helping communities get native plant gardens developed or keeping them maintained after they grow up? You know, sometimes people get enthusiastic about doing these projects and then maybe they aren't maintained as well as you wish they were. People complain and then they get ripped out.
In my experience, the hardest is the maintenance. We generally get people pretty excited about installing a native garden. And signage helps with that, of course. And just FYI, ISN has some great native signs and they're free because they're developed under Creative Commons. So if you want them, you can have PDFs for free. You just have to tell us what you want and promise to tell us if you share them with anyone else so we can keep track. But so signage definitely helps. It can drive that excitement, but it can just be really difficult to get people to keep coming back. And I don't have tons of advice about that.
Personally, I find pulling weeds immensely therapeutic, especially during 2020.
I'm right there with you.
Yeah. Someone was asking if Mark, if you know of any sterile or low fecundity cultivars of Japanese tree lilac. And if not, if you know of any research into that.
I'm not aware of any sterile forms of Japanese tree lilac that have been introduced. I'm not sure, possibly Ryan Contreras at Oregon State University might be working on some of the syringa, but I'm not positive about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting species because it's not really listed by anyone as invasive yet, but I know the Arboretum is seeing some movement of that one, so we're nervous. All right, well, we've gone over time. I'm taking your job, Rachel. I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank Rachel and Tom for doing a great job of moderating and all our speakers in this third session. And all of you for attending. We're gonna start back again at, I believe, 8:30 tomorrow. We've got 3 sessions. First is integrated management, second is herbicide focused management, and the last is outreach and speaking to people on these issues. So thanks so much for joining, and I hope to see you all tomorrow.
Thanks.
Thanks, Claire.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Thanks, Claire, for all your hard work.